I'm Brian, you're watching Wildlife on Display, and today we're going to take a look at the care and husbandry of the blue poison dart frogs. Now as always guys, remember this is all based on my experience with these frogs as well as obviously the research I did before I got them. But keep in mind everyone's care and husbandry is different, and if there's slight variations in the temperatures, the humidity, and all of those little things, then that's fine. Everyone's going to keep reptiles slightly differently. But if it worked for me, it can work for you. Also, keep in mind, guys, dart frogs are an incredibly variable sort of animal, meaning that there's a ton of different localities, a ton of different subspecies, and a few different species even. So it's going to be very difficult to make the care for them in one video. So I'm just not going to do that. Everything I say in this video, I'm talking about Dendrobates tinctorius azureus, the blue poison dart frogs. You can apply a lot of the same care for all poison dart frogs, but not exactly the same. And also, you can apply very, very similar care to all the Dendrobates tinctorius localities. So I believe the black and yellow ones, if I'm not mistaken, are also Dendrobates tinctorius, very similar care. That being said, it is going to be a little bit different from locality and subspecies and species and all of that. So do your research on the specific type of poison dart frog that you want to get. Today we're talking about the blue poison dart frogs, Dendrobates tinctorius azureus. So now on to behavior and handling. These guys have an awesome temperament, and for a creature that's so vibrantly colored, it's spectacular to see them go. I mean, you can see, first of all, there's many different colors of poison dart frogs. I'll put up some pictures, but these are just one of the more popular ones and probably my favorite, which are the blue ones. Blue is a very rare color in nature, and they have a striking, vibrant blue with some beautiful black patterning. But a lot of the time with beautiful animals like that, you'll see that they're reclusive and they're shy, and these guys, you know, they're frogs. They're not good for handling. I'll get into that, but they are so bold. I mean, they're not afraid of you. They'll just come out. They're not bothered if you put your hands like this, or even if you go in the tank, you can get very close before they start to jump away, which they will if you get close enough. But it takes a lot to spook these guys, and they're constantly jumping around, constantly moving, constantly switching direction, constantly jumping and just walking around. They're super active little frogs, which that's another thing with frogs in particular, and a lot of other amphibians, is they tend to be super, super inactive ambush predators. But these guys are hunters. These guys will go out, when you feed them fruit flies, they'll go out and they'll constantly just be picking fruit fly after fruit fly after fruit fly, jumping from place to place. And that's honestly the coolest part about keeping dart frogs, is just watching how active and bold they are in the enclosure with those beautiful colors. So that gives you a little bit of insight into their behavior. Now, onto handling. Guys, these are frogs, and frogs, as well as most amphibians, they're not really good for handling. First of all, these guys are super small, so you can easily injure them through any type of rough handling. But also, being amphibians, they have semi-permeable skin, which means that all the pathogens or chemicals like soap on your skin can get into their system and harm them. So if you haven't washed your hands and you're handling them, then the bacteria on your hands can get into them. And if you wash your hands and then you handle them, then the chemicals from the soap can get into them. So it's very tricky to handle these guys in a way that's safe for them. And also, if you wear gloves, even if you wear gloves, which a lot of people will do when handling them, and if you are going to do it, that's the way to go. But even then, it's hard to put on the gloves without making contact with them and having pathogens on those gloves as well. So they're very sensitive to that. It's just not recommended to handle them. Now, of course, they are called poison dart frogs, and in nature, they're extremely poisonous. So you'd think another reason why they're not going to be good for handling is because you'll die, right? But that's not the case. These guys are not poisonous in captivity. That's because the animals that you feed them in captivity are different from the animals that they eat in the wild. And the way these guys create their poison in the wild is not through poison glands or anything like that, like you see with some toads. These guys will actually get their poison from the ants and insects that they eat in the wild, and then they will process that and digest it in a way that the poison then gets absorbed into their system. But in captivity, you don't feed them anything poisonous, you just feed them fruit flies, so you don't have to worry about the poison. It's more so, the worry with handling is more so that you're going to poison them rather than they're going to poison you. All right, now for diet. The diet of these guys is extremely simple and extremely consistent, which is why a lot of people like them. The thing that's going to change about their diet the most is actually what you supplement them with. So the vitamins and calcium and all the dust that you're going to supplement them with, that's what's going to change. The actual feeder insects can remain pretty much the same throughout their whole life. You can offer a variety, but it's by no means necessary. Fruit flies, that's the name of the game for these guys. So they're going to eat either the smaller species of fruit fly that I don't know what they're called, but they're the smaller species, or the bigger species of fruit fly, which are the Hyaday. And those ones are what I feed to my dart frogs, because being the blue tinctorius, they do get a little bit bigger than a lot of the other dart frogs, so they can eat that bigger species. And so it's just easier for me to feed them that, as opposed to feed them more of the smaller ones. So that's what I do, but really it doesn't matter. If you are feeding a bigger species of dart frog, the smaller one, just you can put more and they'll still eat it. And I know the bigger they get, the more, obviously, the bigger prey you can feed them. So the really big species and really big individuals, you can start to feed them crickets, up to even medium crickets in some cases. But for the most part, with most species, and certainly with these blue tinctorius, which is what the care guide is about, you are going to want to feed them pretty much exclusively fruit flies and maybe some smaller cricket variants. Okay, so as for those supplements, you're going to want to offer them a variety of supplements that can range from calcium, vitamin A is very important for these guys specifically, and vitamin D3, especially if you're not providing them with UVB. I do provide them with UVB, so I give them vitamin D3 with calcium sometimes, and then the rest of the time I give them calcium without vitamin D3, because I don't want to overexpose them to that vitamin D. But those are the main things you're going to need. Calcium supplements, vitamin A supplements, and especially if you don't have UVB, vitamin D3 supplements. So those are the main three. There are more that you can offer them, but those are the staple ones that you need to make sure that they're healthy. So those are the ones we're going to talk about. What I like to do is I like to alternate between the three. And so I feed these guys 3 times a week, and each time I feed them with one or the other. So I feed them vitamin D3 with calcium. That powder is mixed together. So vitamin D3 with calcium, or rather calcium with vitamin D3. And the next feeding, I'll do vitamin A, and in the next feeding, I'll do raw. So just no supplements, just the fruit flies. And so I'll just repeat that process every week, and then I'll alternate week by week. Sometimes I will do the calcium without D3, and sometimes I'll do the calcium with D3, since I'm providing UVB. So that's pretty much my supplementing schedule, and you can use that if you'd like. It's worked great for me. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow them to take a break off of the supplements, because you don't want to provide too much supplements that can oversaturate their body with these vitamins and minerals, and it can actually do a lot of harm to them. So you don't want to overdo it. So offering that one time a week that you're going to feed them without any supplements is crucial. And then obviously not feeding them too much calcium or too much vitamin A is also crucial. So just balance those things out. If you feed them 3 times a week, do what I do. Feed them once with no supplements, once with calcium, with or without D3, and once with vitamin A. Okay, now the last thing is the amount that you want to feed them and how often you want to feed them. Like I said, I feed them 3 times a week, but you could feed them 4 or even 5 times a week, depending on how much you're feeding them per feeding. I like to feed mine a lot for every feeding, because they're always moving around, always active. So they're always going to be hunting those fruit flies. And even if they don't finish what I give them in the day that I give it to them, they're going to be hunting them throughout the next few days that I'm not going to be putting more fruit flies in. And so having that 3 times a week is perfect, because they always have something to eat. Although obviously in the days in between feedings, there's going to be less fruit flies to eat, which is good. You don't want them to become fat, but that's worked great. Mine are a perfect weight, perfect size, and I've fed them on that. It also keeps it simple for the supplement schedule because there's 3 different types of supplementation. One of them is no supplements, one of them is vitamin A, and the other one's calcium, and there's 3 feedings in the week. So that makes it simple for that as well. And so that's what I do. You could do 4 or 5 if you're feeding them less, but you're gonna see in the footage, I feed them a lot every time I feed them, so it works for me. Okay, so let's get into it. We'll start with my setup. As you can see, these guys are on the glass. They like to do that a lot when the glass is wet, they stick to it. But this is my setup, and this is typically a lot like what you're gonna see with most dart frog setups, in the sense that I've got some pothos in here, which is a very easy to keep and maintain plant that occupies a lot of space, and the substrate is bioactive. It's loaded with springtails. I don't have isopods with these guys because I feel like they can eat them very easily and they're expensive, but I do have a bunch of springtails in there, and this is a nice bioactive enclosure with some leaf litter at the bottom. This is typically what you want with dart frogs because their environment is, as you can tell, going to be very humid, which is very good for keeping most easy to maintain plants. And the other thing with these guys that's going to be very popular is the leaf litter, because it's going to keep them off the soil, which is going to get dirty over time, even if it is bioactive. And even if you are doing spot cleanings, which you should be, it's going to keep them off of the pathogens in the soil, the potential pathogens in the soil, as well as provide shelter for them if they want to hide under the leaf litter. And these guys are very tiny, so they can make very good use of that. The other thing with these guys, as you can see, is they are going to make use of floor space, but also vertical space. So you're going to want to offer them things like branches and stuff like I have over here for them to climb on. You're going to see in the footage that I'm going to put in the video that these guys love to climb on those branches, and they make very good use of it. So you should always be providing some vertical space. Some people even recommend going with a more vertically oriented enclosure if you can provide a background that allows them to walk up like stairs, but it's perfectly fine to keep them in just a regular 20-gallon for a group of them, and as long as you're providing branches, that's not going to really affect them at all. Now, as I said, this is a 20-gallon, which is kind of the minimum that you're going to want for a group of 4 of these guys. Maybe later in the future, I'll upgrade them to a 30-gallon if I see that they need it. They're not adults quite yet, they're getting there, but when they are, I am probably going to upgrade them to something like a 30-gallon, but 20-gallon is the minimum for a group of 4, which I recommend keeping 4 or 5 around there. Too many in a small enclosure can lead to fighting, as well as just, you know, common issues with having a cramped enclosure. So I recommend a 20-gallon for a group of 4 or less, and of course, bigger is always better. Okay, so let's move on now to lighting and heating. So as for heating, I'll do first. These guys do extremely well at room temperature, so you don't really need any heating aside from the very little light that's emitted off of UVB if you choose to provide them with it, which I definitely recommend. And lighting, now these guys, a lot of people will say they don't need UVB, and I'm sure that you could make it work, but from all the research I've done, it seems like these guys do very, very well on UVB. It's very good to provide them with it, and UVB is very good for a lot of animals, even if it's an animal like dart frogs, which are going to be under things a lot of the time and in branches covered by foliage a lot of the times in their environment. They're still going to be exposed to sunlight a lot in their environment. So what I've done in my enclosure is I've provided UVB to one side, and it's also the side with the pothos, so they can, even on that side, they can escape the UVB by going under the pothos and in between the branches, just like they would in the wild. And the other side doesn't have any UVB at all to avoid overexposing them, which is a concern that a lot of people have. But I definitely recommend offering them some UVB. It can also help to create that heat gradient that I was talking about earlier, because you don't want to add a heat lamp into their enclosure unless it gets very, very cold where you're at, because that's going to overheat the enclosure. But a UV lamp is both going to provide them with some amount of UVB exposure, which I think is going to be very beneficial to them. And also, it's going to sort of allow you to have that soft heat, that warm heat That isn't going to overheat the enclosure, but it is going to make one side a little bit warmer than the other side to create that thermal heat gradient. So now we're going to address temperature and humidity. Now, as for humidity, these guys are going to like it very, very humid. First of all, where they're from, it's a tropical rainforest. They're from South America, by the way, the rainforest of South America. So it's going to be very, very tropical and very, very moist and very, very humid where they are. So that's going to make it so that they are going to require high humidity just because of where they live in the environment. But also, they're frogs, they're amphibians, so they do require a lot of that elevated humidity even for their environment. So whereas other creatures that live where they live, like certain geckos, would like it humid, these guys like it really humid. So a lot of the time you find care guides saying that they can live in up to 100% humidity or close to 100% humidity. And I think that's a little high. I think the mid 80s would be perfect. So if you could maintain the mid 80s most of the time with the enclosure obviously drying out for a period throughout the day, then that would be ideal. But I would recommend definitely not going below 75% humidity, because that's going to be lethal to your frog over time. If you go below 75%, your frog is going to start to dry out. So it's very important to keep these guys very humid with daily misting. As you can see, this enclosure is very humid, which is why he's able to stick to the glass like that. So yeah, I would mist 1 to maybe 2 times a day, depending where you live. I only mist once a day. I live in Florida, and my reptile room is very humid. So I've only misted once a day, and it's worked very well for me. But if you live somewhere like Arizona or anywhere that's dry, really, then it's going to be ideal for you to mist probably twice a day for these guys. They do need very high humidity, and you need to keep up with that every single day. That's one thing about these guys. They're very easy to take care of, but you are going to need daily upkeep, and they also need to be fed very frequently as well. Now they're going to want temperatures between the low 70s to the low 80s. So ideally what that means is you're going to have one side of the enclosure that's going to lean more towards the low 70s, 72, 70. At night it can drop into the high 60s and sort of escalate into the mid 70s to high 70s in that one side of the enclosure. And then towards the other side, you can have it going into the very, very low 80s. But honestly, if the entire enclosure is in the 70s, that's perfectly fine. You're not going to have any issues. More so, you see people having issues with overheating their dart frogs because they are very delicate with heat. And also, they can't dry out. Being amphibians, they are going to need high humidity, which we'll get into later. So overall, you're going to want a room temperature enclosure, and ideally a heat gradient between 73, 72 to 80, I wouldn't say past 82 degrees. Alright guys, so that's going to be all. I'm going to keep the outro simple. Hope you guys liked it. Like, subscribe, see you.